Welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast number 720. The SPaMCAST is on a 3-week hiatus. We'll be back with new programming on September 25th. In the interim, I asked the SPaMCAST columnists, that's Jeremy, John, Susan, and Tony, for a couple of favorite columns they delivered. Today we have John M. Quigley from SPaMCAST 397, Project Strategy. Actually, this is his inaugural column. Not the first time on the podcast, but his inaugural column. So enjoy that. Then we have Susan Parente and John M. Quigley together from SPaMCAST 585. Most agile transformations ignore technical skills. By the way, that's not a good idea. So enjoy. John M. Quigley, welcome and thank you for bringing your brand new column to the Software Process and Measurement Cast.
My pleasure.
Hey, John, before we dive in, I know that we've done an interview before. Most of the people on the cast probably have listened to that. If they haven't, they should go back and listen to it. Tell people who you are and why they should be listening to you.
Well, I'm been around a little bit. It's kind of interesting. You go through a lot of experiences when you've been around a little bit, especially when you have an inquisitive nature. I started off as writing code for embedded industrial products and to embedded automotive products, to testing embedded automotive products, to project management, to management. I just had a lot of experience with and a variety of experience with product development in general. And what's better than burning your hand on a stove to learn, although that's an appropriate way to learn, is to let somebody else burn their hand on a stove and learn what hot looks like. That can be helpful. It saves you the pain.
John, you were a serial author. Give the listeners a sense of the breadth of the wonderful books that you've written.
I've collaborated with a number of people, Kim Priest and Kim Robertson, as luck would have it, a couple of Kims. And we've produced... And Rupa Shenoy, I'm sorry, I forgot Rupa, the latest book. And they're around project management and product development and testing of products and cost control and total quality management applied to project management, configuration management, anything that's related to product development and manufacturing that piques my interest, or my interest along with somebody else, whoever I'm writing with.
Well, there you go in terms of that learning and curiosity all rolled up into one. John, why don't we dive in today with project risk and scope and strategy selection? Lots of ands, but how are those all interrelated?
They are all interrelated. The things you choose to do in your project set the tone for the risk. The way you choose to attack your project likewise sets the tone for the risk. And I'll give you some examples. There's a study from the Standish Group, I think it's the latest chaos report, that indicates the size of the project has a great influence over the success or failure rate, as in the larger the scope, the larger the project, the higher incidence of failure. There's a number of studies that reflect that. Beyond 6 months, 6 months seems to be kind of the optimum, but beyond 6 months, you start to see a decay in success rate. There's a large study from Capers-Jones that shows that the number of function points that your product or project has means more function points means more change requests. More change requests means higher probability of something going wrong.
And obviously, the longer that project would take, would you suggest that that's, to go back to Deming perhaps a little bit, after 6 months, we just sort of lose focus and start wandering away to another area or start tampering with things?
It could be that. It could also be, besides the lack of focus, is our thinking that we can predict 9, 12, 15 months out. So we set the stage in the beginning for what 15 months out is going to look like, but we don't have a clue what that's really going to be. We're going to learn a lot between 0 and 6 months or 9 months that may impact. So if you start framing the success discussion at T equals 0 months for 15 months out, you're probably going to fail.
So project risk, how do you define project risk?
It's those, PMI calls it the upside and the downside they see there's a risk of doing of a benefit, right? But I generally see it as just the negative side. For me, the other side is opportunity and not really a risk. But sometimes Project PMI refers to it as two different things. It's the uncertainty that can produce a positive or negative event. For me, I'm more focused on the negative side of the event. So it's the things that can reduce our probability of achieving what we're trying to do with this project.
If project risk is related to scope, and in terms of the bigger the scope, the higher the risk, how is project risk then related to the strategy selection?
I'll give you an example, a story. I'll tell a story as an example. I worked at a place, and they had it was an automotive company, and they had an emissions project, which means you have to have this thing delivered at a particular date. January 1st, you had to have the thing certified, right? January, they decided there were two solutions. One was to add a little tiny electronic control unit or a small subsystem to this existing system, and you could meet the emission standard. They had about a year and maybe a year and a half to get to it. Now, the standard itself was subject to CARB and EPA, and it was kind of volatile, as in you learned the last minute. Some of the things you need to know come out at the last minute. One solution is to add this small electronic control unit as a subsystem, and another solution was to gut the entire system and merge this platform onto a common platform, or try to merge into a common platform from a European variant. The second solution presented itself with some long-term business opportunities, but it also presented a great deal of risk because it meant taking everything or most everything that was already on the vehicle and reworking the communication system, reworking every message, reworking all the interactions to even electronic control units that were not related to the emissions. Ooh. The first one was a simple, small addition, a couple of messages. For me, the simpler one, the better strategy, would have been to take the smaller scope one, the addition of the small electronic control unit or subsystem, and then figure a plan to converge this present iteration of the vehicle electronic system into this common spot that would be easier to support globally, not bound by an emissions deadline.
When should these decisions be made?
In the beginning. I think if somebody would have looked at by the way, that project delivered really late, as in I think it was 3 months at least late that things were being built and set aside. The thing to do is to, when you know the scope, is to addressing what you think could go wrong in the strategy or the scope. It doesn't matter, right? Mm-hmm. Use some kind of decision matrix and a weighted decision matrix or some other mechanism to try and give you as objective a perspective as you can regarding what you intend to do, rather than I want to do this, so we're going to do this, even though maybe it's not the best solution.
That's always the hard part, right? Because it's easier, or maybe not easier, but it's more attractive to do the thing that you want to do that's a little bit more sexy than the thing that you might have maybe a little rework later on to merge the two, and it isn't that sexy up front.
Yeah, you're right. And it is easier. You're right. It's easier to pull from the hip and pick a solution rather than go through the list of possibilities and try to select the optimum. That takes time, and that's time ticking on your clock.
Absolutely. Well, John, this has been fantastic. This is a good first entry into your column. And actually, why don't we ask the listeners? We're struggling. I guess we'll pierce that barrier here. We're struggling with naming John's column. So I think it would be good if our listeners listen and perhaps give us some feedback on what perhaps is a good name.
That is an excellent idea. I like that, Tom.
Okay. So until next time, John, how would the listeners to the Software Process and Measurement Cast, how would they find you? How would they continue this conversation with you?
I'm on LinkedIn at John M. Quigley. I'm on Twitter at John M. Quigley, and you can email me john.quigley@valuetransform.com any way you wish.
Obviously, we'll have that in the show notes. John, until next time, fantastic first outing.
Thank you, Tom.
Susan Parente, John M. Quigley, welcome back to the Software Process Measurement Cast. You guys are almost always on, I think, 1 or 2 weeks apart, but you're never on the cast at the same time, or very rarely. So today I would like to sort of have a group discussion and talk about perhaps we are not in the purest Agile form. Perhaps we're not focusing as much on technology, or at least the technology side of the equation, and more on the project management. Before we get started, I know people have, read your bios, been out to the website, but why don't we talk through who are you and why are you here? Susan, why don't you go first?
Okay, so first of all, Tom, thanks for having me back, and it's great to be here with John. So a little bit about myself. I call myself not a Scrum-Dementalist, an Agile specialist. And that means that I don't think if it's broke, we should throw Agile at it. It means we should be a little bit more mindful about that. I also focus on risk management. So those are my 2 areas of subject matter expertise. I did start my career in software development. My background's in engineering, so this is a perfect conversation. I somehow got myself into project management before I realized I was a project manager, which is very, very common for my age group, I guess, and for a lot of us. And I now teach project management, program management, Agile, risk management, you name it, type of stuff.
Nice.
John?
I started out as an engineer, likewise, in doing embedded industrial controls and moved to embedded automotive applications, and stumbled into project management similarly as you did. I was an engineer doing test work, and eventually some of the test work got distributed elsewhere, and they said, okay, so it's time for you to do project work and maintain some measure of product testing. I call myself a product development specialist because I've done all I can do in 30 years to learn not just the discipline of creativity part, or the lack of discipline for the creativity part, but the other things that go along with successfully delivering our project or product to the marketplace. I have an MBA in marketing because I know if you design a product that doesn't meet the customer need, you're kind of screwed. And project management degree for the similar reason. If you can't deliver it on time and on target, you likewise have a problem. So my time has been spent on those kind of things.
So interestingly enough, John, I have a master's in engineering management with a focus in marketing and technology, and I kind of feel the same way. So it's sort of like we are very applied, practical engineers who believe that creating a great thing that can't be sold and that nobody wants isn't really useful. So that actually lands us squarely in Agile. I think that's perfect.
Nice. I tend to differ a little bit there. I think it's the right tool for the right job. If what you're doing is working, then you probably don't need to change. If some parts of what you're doing works, you probably don't need to change that part. Change to meet the demand, and that means those people that say always this, I tend to say, I'm not so sure if that's always going to be the case, or never waterfall or a stage gate approach. Not waterfall, it's called stage gate. Never a stage gate approach. I would say that's probably not always true. And so it's more of right size for right thing.
That's why Susan runs the Not a Scrum-Dementalist column. You guys are definitely very similar peas in the same pod. Let's actually roll back and actually start to tackle the idea. We've gone through this Agile revolution, and it really has been a revolution. Let's face it, when the major stage gate folks are buying up all of the larger Agile organizations, just like the large beer companies are buying up all the big craft beer companies, have we focused, or should we at least now segue to focus on the technology side? Can we mindset value into creation, perhaps?
Some of the problem as I see it is when it comes to the creation part, particularly the Well, okay, creativity doesn't follow a schedule and doesn't necessarily follow a rigid, formalized process. It happens and comes when it comes. It's driven partly by from my perspective, it's driven largely actually by the gap between where you think you need to be and where you want to go. Kind of that tension of this isn't quite right. That spurs that creativity part. So putting a lot of rules on that part and fixating on that might be a little difficult if that's what you're asking.
I'm not sure I am, but if we have an idea and we can't code it, or we have an idea that we can code and we can't test, or we have an idea that we can code and test but we can't implement, what value is it? So again, I think we focus on having the right agile mindset, having a backlog, having our daily stand-ups if we're doing Scrum, or having our Kanban board. But we've forgotten that we have to continually refresh and focus on ensuring that our technical approaches fit the medium.
I think I know what you're saying. It's almost like, and I hate to use the word process in agile, but there are processes depending on which you use. We can pretend like there aren't, but it's not a free for all. And there's a lot of focus on that and how to do it, but not as much focus on what to do. So like when I was in engineering school, we were very focused on what to do. And then the aftermath of that is we learned a little bit about project management and how to do it. But the focus was on how do you design a good solution, right? And so part of that is you need to know the requirements. Well, we know we don't know all the requirements up front. So you want to build a bridge, and then I start building the bridge and then find out you don't want to walk over it. You want to drive tractor trailers over it. Well, that kind of changes things. So it makes it challenging, like from an architectural perspective. And this is why a lot of agile projects I've been a part of have more of a hybrid type of project, because from an architectural perspective, I need to know tractor trailers are going over the bridge. You know, from other perspectives of the project, like what color we're going to paint the bridge, not so critical from an engineering development perspective, maybe critical from a value perspective to the customer. Believe it or not, the color of whatever, I've done a lot of web design, and the color of the page can totally throw the customer off and they could be upset about it. Little things like that. And you're like, but the whole thing works. We have the database, everything, you know, and they worry about the color. So I think that there's a lot of education on how we do it and the process and the practices and principles of agile, and not as much focus on what we're doing. And then if you throw in on top of that, in agile, we look for T type of people, not I type of people. So we don't want people to be specifically expertise in a certain area. We want them to be more broad span experts. We want them to be able to test. We want them to be able to do development in different areas, even things they don't know a lot about. We want them to know a little bit about. And so it's a different venue than perhaps what some of us are used to, where, you know, I'm good at this one part of development, and, you know, I do the coding, and this person does the development, and this person does the testing. And in Agile, we're told, don't do that. You need to be like good at everything. I always question how you can be good at everything. I think you should be aware of all those things and knowledgeable so you can work together as a team. But in all reality, there is no person I've ever met who's equally good at all those things.
I'm going to call a little bit of bull on not everybody. I don't think everybody is great at everything, but I am in the presence, and we're doing this, there's a video chat going on here. I'm in the presence of two very, very probably M or other letter-shaped people, right? Susan, you've written, you teach, you consult, you have a broad platform of things that you're very good at. John, I'm looking in the background of your picture. I know that you're a bass guitarist. I know that you have 14 or some odd books. I know that so I think,
I likewise teach. Sorry about that.
yeah, so all of those things are there. There are a lot of us that are not, we that are broader shape than a single eye. I love that I, T, and unfortunately all good metaphors get beaten to death, right? They're now E-shaped people, M-shaped people, pie-shaped people, and not blueberry. We have people, and we want people to be this broader sense, whether they're perfect experts or just they are aware of it, to use your term, Susan. Have we put the product owner aside for a second, the scrum master aside for a second, the rest of the team, have we given them the tools to actually be successful in short iterations that can deliver stuff to production at the end of every iteration? Have we given them the tools and the education to actually live in that world?
I sort of think that doesn't happen overnight anyway. And the people on the team have to be sort of if there's ever a place where people need to be a continuous learner, it is most definitely in an agile team rather than the Ford described kind of circumstance where I write software. I just write software. I work with a guy who used to say, named Wally, I just stuff boards because he built prototype parts. And this was back in through whole day. So, he would say I just stuff boards, but that's not how it works in an agile world, or even in many companies, especially the smaller ones. So some of it is just a time focusing over time to allow those other things to mature, other than the product specific, but our team's understanding of the processes that are not agile but are required for the product to mature appropriately, and that includes the content of the product and how we handle those iterations.
Susan?
Yeah, I agree that continuous learning is a part of Agile, and that's not only focused on process, but on the product and development. And my thought with that is it's partially the job of those team members to like raise their hand and say, hey, I don't know enough about this coding language or this database structure, this architecture, and I need to learn more about it. And I would say if it's Scrum, the Scrum Master's job would be to help with that, because that's actually an impediment, right?
Yeah.
So it would show up as this is an impediment to me developing this, to me doing this work. And then the solutions either learn from somebody else, you could do, some paired development, or you do some outside training, or you can use something like a Spike to do some research, do some learning. So there's different types of learning you can do. But I do think that that's important. I don't know how much of that occurs, to be honest with you. I know when I was leading teams in the federal government, I would always go to my senior developer or junior developer every year or even every 6 months and say, hey, what education would make you better at what you do? And let's go send you for a few days. And I would always push for that. I will tell you that was tough with my management, because that person's then off-site. Now they're not available to do work, and they're only billable when they're there. But then my thought is like, well, how efficient are you if you're just doing the same thing and producing the same results? To me, it's about improving. And so part of that improvement is to be better at those things that you do and know what it is that you're weak at and be able to augment that. And some of it can be on the job, but some of it may require going to a training class. And I'm as an educator and a person with a lot of certifications, I'm definitely interested in continuous learning and training. I mean, to me, I'll stop learning when I die. Yep. I don't plan to stop before then. And I think if I do stop before then, I'm basically dying already. So, I mean, that's just how I approach life. And and I wouldn't be surprised if John feels the same way. Everybody I know who teach because they like to learn. Mm-hmm. And it engages me to do that. That's why I'm writing. I, took vacation last week and part of this week. And during that time, I was still writing. And that's really I'm actually, hey, I have some free time. I can write. And writing, I learn when I write, because I'm pulling together thoughts and ideas and creating new things. And that whole process is about learning. And I think that's the continuous improvement and the retrospective isn't just about how you work with the team, but it's what are the impediments to you performing and delivering on the product that creates value for your customer.
Prior to us or me hitting the record button, we were chatting. And John, you mentioned the architecture terms, and there are multiple levels of architecture. And if Gene Hewson was here, he could tell us all about that. But we're putting teams, we're transforming teams, they're becoming agile, and then they're working. Most people don't end up with a brand new product that they're working on. They're working on top of a product that's been around for a while, that has all sorts of decisions that have been made in the past. I won't even call it legacy. I argue that anything's in production is a legacy. But they are dealing with all of that. I don't know that every time those transformations happen, whether they can pick up a piece of work then and actually do it in 2 weeks, or do it in a week, or do it in whatever their cadence is, and take it from soup to nuts. Again, I don't know that we focus on teaching them how to deal with breaking work down, changing architectures, those sorts of things that would have been, in many organizations, done for them and then handed to them and say, thou shalt just do this kind of thing. Now they're self-organizing, self-managing. How do we get out of that?
Yeah, that's a good question, because, for example, if you look at the automotive industry, let's say in my experience, there's a group that often articulates what the system looks like. Now, they don't do that without the development, individual component development, or system by component. I mean, what we would call an electronic control unit, which is an individual piece of embedded something, like a brake unit, like transmission control or something like that. But anyway, you have the system apportioned done by a whole separate department. And so that skill set resides in a department usually separated from a Scrum team, for example, that might be focusing on an individual component. So the system level skill may not exist in the individual Scrum team, because it doesn't matter whether we're talking about the micro level of a system or the macro level of the system. In terms of a vehicle, we're talking about vehicle architecture and the individual distribution of the functions across the platform. In the case of a discrete product, discrete component on that architecture, we would have embedded part like the ABS controller. So systems engineers aren't necessarily hanging out in that group. So somebody had find a way to get that knowledge or those skill sets transferred into the Scrum team.
Is that a realistic answer? I mean, Susan, in the world that you spend most of your time in, and that's more varied, is that translation of architecture to team possible?
And the way that I've seen architecture play out with Agile is more in a hybrid arena, that the architecture is really done in a more traditional, or as John said, like a stage gate format. I can think of one very large program, federal government program, and I'm not going to mention names because it may end up being like the next healthcare.gov. So I don't even want to be affiliated with that. But anyway, unfortunately, these things happen. So this program, they're using Agile for the development. However, it's a series of projects. I guess when I was supporting it, it was maybe 12 to 14 different projects and different products that all had to communicate with each other, talk to each other. They were using Agile for development, but there's no way that they could develop the architecture that they were all talking on in an Agile way, because everybody needed that to be there. It's kind of like the train tracks, that all the trains are running on. So everybody's developing these trains to run on the tracks, but the tracks can't be developed agilely. I mean, they could if it were one product, but because there's multiple products and multiple projects, you can't do it that way. I've heard people talk about Agile as like building the plane while you're flying it. And so I guess you could say putting the track down while you're riding the train. But if you're riding, 12 trains from 12 different directions, you kind of need to have a plan before you get the trains on the track. There needs to be a structure there, because I'm thinking like hobbyist trains, like O gauge, H gauge. If you're developing trains at all different gauges, and then you get together and you're like, wow, these don't talk to each other. I can't ride my train on your tracks. So I think that the way I've seen it is that architecture does have to have more planning with it, more agreements, and to me, it's not necessarily even like the right thing, but picking something and communicating it. And what I like about Agile is we can act in the moment. We can listen to requirements and change things and nuance things, but it doesn't mean I start out needing a plane and I end up with a train. Like, it's not that different. When we do Agile projects, we do have an end game in mind. People act like you literally start with a blank board and then you end up creating something and you had no idea what you were going to create. And I don't think that's the intention. Because to me, I don't know anybody who'd want to spend money on that, either inside of an organization or for an outside customer. You want to have an idea of what's the end game. You might not have all the answers for everything, and that's totally fine. And I think that it's better to wait on some decisions because you get more clarity as time goes on. And that's what I like about Agile. It's the ability to deal with change. Coming from a background in engineering, change board meetings every week, and it was always like pulling teeth. Like, God forbid you change something when you're in the middle of it. There was all this like, what do you call, friction to not allow change to happen, right? And so that the response to that is Agile, where it's like, we welcome change. And I think that's great. So from a development perspective, as an engineer, I love that change is welcome, because as I'm working on something, guess what? I realize something different. I realize there's a need that the customer didn't even ask for. But as I'm developing, I realize that. And so I always want that from a creative perspective. I want the ability to make change, and I want to be able to engage with the customer. So as a developer, I think Agile is like totally makes sense. However, I do think there's a lack, as you're bringing up here, there's a lack of focus on being a good developer. We're so focused on doing Agile right, doing the practices right, doing the method right. And we're back in that place of doing project management right, as opposed to doing the right things.
That was, to me, that was one of the big failures of Stage Gate. It's a regimented process. Eventually, it distills down to a checklist, and nobody knows why that particular item was there, or what the attributes of that checklist, of that particular item on the checklist is that would constitute, yes, yea, verily, I have met this item on the checklist. It becomes more of, did you do for example, a design failure mode effects analysis? Well, we sat around in a group and we kind of kicked the tires of the product, and okay, so DFMEA gets checked off. That has nothing to do with what a DFMEA is.
I think we're all in agreement that there has to be some degree of focus on the technical side. I actually had a call early this morning with Europe, and someone was using an example where they have an agile team. They have a large program, agile team, and they're developing their own requirements and user stories. There are more to that story in its own right. And then for an interface with an outside system without talking to the people in the outside system. And then getting very shocked when the two systems won't talk to each other. And obviously it's those other guys' problem because we created our own user stories kind of thing. Obviously that's not only a broken agile process, but it's a broken technical process too. How can we integrate the whole idea of giving the coders, testers, designers, architects on our teams the tools to actually be agile? Because we know that, agile is good from the point of view of delivering stuff faster. Don't we, how do we get there more efficiently and make sure that we get the right stuff there?
I have some thoughts about that. So this is actually going to be a non-technical answer, but I think it's a valuable one. I think of servant leadership. So what can I do to help you be successful so we can be successful? And I think that there needs to be that engagement with the team to make sure that team members have the skills and resources they need to do that work. So even so I'm addressing your technical need, but it's by communicating and not just being open for when somebody asks for something, but like actively going to them and saying, what do you need to be successful? What, if you haven't mentioned them, what are your impediments? What can I do to get those out of the way? That's what the Scrum Master should be doing. That's what they should be there for, is to support the team in whatever they need to be doing the best work that they can do. And that's not a focus on process, but instead on resources, because resources are usually what's lacking. We don't have enough time. We don't have enough people. We don't have enough money. We don't have the software that we need. I actually was talking to somebody the other day. I was on a contract supporting program management, and I didn't have Microsoft Project, and I had to request it. And I think 3 weeks later, I got it. I'm like, seriously? That's kind of like a long wait, So
Yeah.
meanwhile, I'm supposed to support project managers, and I can't even use the software. And it's not like it wasn't a problem for me to have the software. It's just that the whole process to get it had so much bureaucracy, that's how long it took me to get it. And so that's a type of thing where I think we need to, what is it you need, and how can I help you to be successful? And so that's how I would solve that problem, because that actually works in any technical arena.
I would add a little bit to what you said. It's not just the resources that are. First, I generally don't like calling people resources, but it's what we do. So, but it's not just resources in terms of people and money and time. It's the knowledge, which I guess you could connect to people via talent. And so I would add that one into the list of things. It's not just the Scrum Master shouldn't be necessarily only ask around these other questions that get in the way of the schedule and whatnot, but what do you need to know, and how would we go about finding out what you need to know? What do you know now compared to what you should know to accomplish this? Those sort of gaps also need to be explored. And for me, the Scrum Master should be asking a lot of questions in general, beyond the questions about schedule and content going into a product. It should be also about the manner in which we go about moving those things into the product, or getting those things done, accomplished in the product. And that uncovers, things like architecture needs or specific adaptations, technical adaptations required to meet some performance objective.
Well, I agree with you on resources. I actually was not just thinking human resources. Like for my example with software, not having access to the software you need, not having the training that you need. I can think of many a project where I was asked to do something that I knew nothing about. And they were like, oh, okay, well, I guess you got to learn about that. I'm like, oh, okay.
Let me ask you this. When you didn't know anything about, did you know what kind of training you needed to make that happen?
Yes, but there was no funding for the training. So
so that's a different, what I was trying to allude to was that sometimes we don't know what we don't know, so we can't tell you what it takes to move us from where we are now to some other future state, because we don't know what that is.
Once upon a time, back before the dawn of recorded history, back when there were dinosaurs, there was this thing called the CMMI. And you're going to pull out your CMMI book. I could do the same thing.
I was going to, but I'm not going to. Yes.
One of the things that was in there was, there we are. Yes, okay. All three of us could do that.
Yes.
One of the things that was in there was, and this was before it became more of a check the box kind of thing, there was a whole process area that talked about figuring out where strategically you wanted the knowledge base of your organization to go and plan to get there. I don't know that we necessarily do that today, and I don't necessarily know that we do that with technical people. So again, there are lots of ideas that have come, gone, and probably need to come back as something more effective and proactive than, hey, did I do it or I didn't do it kind of thing. I know we've done this many a time on the podcast individually, but John, how would people continue this conversation with you?
I'm on LinkedIn at John M. Quigley, and you can email me at john.quigley@valuetransform.com.
Susan?
I am also on LinkedIn, Susan Parente, and you can email me parente@s3-tec.com.
Super. And all of that obviously will be in the show notes. John, Susan, this has been fantastic. I like these small, sort of intimate conversations. Thank you. And it was marvelous. And hey, so have a marvelous afternoon. Well, that's not true. Have a marvelous morning, then have a marvelous afternoon. Remember, do you have questions that you would like Susan, John, Jeremy, Tony, or myself to answer? Leave us a message at 01440-668-5717 or an email at spamcastinfo@gmail.com. In Reread Saturday Notes, I am packaging this show well ahead of time. Therefore, all I can say for sure about the reread is to remember to buy a copy of Coaching Agile Teams by Liz Atkins. Link in the show notes, and then read along. A quick advertisement. Controlling work entry requires preparation and knowledge building to establish a path to control work entry. No magic wands here, which is why Jeremy Willits and I have developed a work entry workshop. We recently delivered the workshop at the Path to Agility 2022 conference in Columbus to rave reviews. If you're interested, drop us an email, tcagley@tomcagley.com or willitsjm@gmail.com. We'd love to do this workshop for you. Next week, we feature more of Jeremy Berriault, Susan Parente, and Tony Timbol. If process improvement is a never-ending journey, why do so many people ask, are we there yet?